In the sprawling hill country of Texas, Barrett Langford owns more land than most men can dream of. After his wife's passing 3 years ago, this wealthy rancher decides it's time to find a new bride. But not just any woman will do. He wants perfection, a refined lady from good family, educated in all the proper ways, someone worthy of the Langford name and fortune. Word spreads across the state, and soon his grand ranch house fills with the most eligible women money can attract. Each one more polished than the last, each one eager to claim the title of Mrs. Langford. Meanwhile, Lina Reyes, the quiet maid who keeps his household running, watches this parade of suitors from the shadows. She tends to his horses, scrubs his floors, and dreams of nothing more than a small garden to call her own. But will Barrett discover that what makes a perfect wife has nothing to do with breeding or wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Texas hill country in shades of gold and amber as Barrett Langford stood on the wide porch of his ranch house, coffee mug in hand, surveying the vast expanse of land that had been in his family for 4 generations. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never wanted for anything. Yet his dark eyes held a melancholy that seemed to deepen with each passing season since Eleanor's death. The Langford Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of rolling hills and fertile valleys, dotted with prize-winning cattle and thoroughbred horses that commanded respect at every auction from San Antonio to Fort Worth. The main house, a testament to Texas prosperity, rose from the landscape like something from a gentleman's magazine. White columns, wraparound porches, and windows that caught the light just so. Barrett's great-grandfather had built it with cattle money and determination, and each generation had added their own touches of refinement and comfort. But wealth, Barrett had learned the hard way, could not fill the empty spaces in a man's heart or warm a bed grown cold with loss. Eleanor had been everything a rancher's wife should be: gracious, beautiful, well-educated, and perfectly suited to entertain the wives of cattle barons and oil men who came calling. She had transformed their home into a showcase of elegance, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across polished hardwood floors and Persian rugs whispered beneath the feet of distinguished guests. Her portrait still hung above the marble fireplace in the parlor, capturing her gentle smile and the pearl necklace that had belonged to his grandmother. Now, 3 years after consumption had claimed her, Barrett found himself rattling around, in rooms that felt too large, too quiet, too filled with memories of what once was. The silence pressed against him during the long evenings when he sat in his study, reading the same page of a book 3 times without absorbing a single word. It was during one such evening, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the weight of solitude, that Barrett had opened the Langford family Bible, a massive tome bound in cracked leather that chronicled 4 generations of births, deaths, and marriages. His finger traced the carefully penned entries: his great-grandfather's marriage to Martha in 1847, his grandfather's union with Catherine in 1875, his father's wedding to his mother in 1903, and finally, his own marriage to Eleanor in 1928. The D pattern was clear. Each Langford man had chosen a wife of refinement, education, and proper breeding. Women who could manage a grand household, host important gatherings, and raise children who would honor the family name. It was tradition, expectation, and practical wisdom all rolled into one. A man of his standing required a partner who understood the responsibilities that came with wealth and position. This realization had crystallized his decision. He would remarry, but he would choose carefully, deliberately. He would find a woman who embodied all the qualities that made a proper rancher's wife, someone who could step into Eleanor's role with grace and dignity. While Barrett contemplated his future in the grand rooms upstairs, Lina Reyes moved through the house like a quiet shadow, tending to tasks that kept the great estate running smoothly. At 28, She possessed an understated beauty that went largely unnoticed, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, warm brown eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were strong from years of honest work. Lina had come to the ranch 5 years ago, shortly after her father's death, had left her family's small farm in foreclosure. Barrett's previous housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had taken pity on the quiet young woman and hired her as an assistant. When Mrs. Patterson retired 2 years later, Lina had naturally assumed the full responsibilities of managing the household. She knew every corner of the grand house, which floorboards creaked in the early morning, how to coax the temperamental, stove in the kitchen to perfect heat, where dust gathered despite her careful attention. She understood the rhythms of Barrett's days. Coffee at dawn on the porch, breakfast at 7 sharp, business meetings in his study during the afternoon, and solitary dinners that grew cold while he stared out the window. What Barrett didn't realize was how carefully Lina observed him during these quiet moments. She saw past the confident exterior to the loneliness that had settled around him like morning fog. She noticed how his shoulders relaxed when he worked with the horses, how his face softened when he read letters from his sister in Dallas, how he sometimes stood at Eleanor's portrait for long minutes, lost in memories she couldn't fathom. Lina's own dreams were simple by comparison. She had grown up helping her mother tend a small garden behind their modest farmhouse, learning the names of herbs and flowers, understanding which plants thrived in Texas soil and which needed extra care. Even now, in her small room behind the kitchen, she kept a few potted plants on her windowsill. Nothing fancy, just cheerful marigolds and sturdy herbs that reminded her of home. Sometimes, during rare quiet moments, she allowed herself to imagine having a garden of her own someday. Not grand or elaborate, just a small patch of earth where she could plant vegetables and flowers, where she could kneel in the soil and feel connected to something growing and alive. It seemed an impossible dream for a woman in her position. But she treasured it nonetheless. As evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, Barrett closed the family Bible and made his decision. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of finding his new bride. He would place advertisements in the finest newspapers across Texas, seeking a woman of quality and refinement who could take her place beside him as mistress of the Langford Ranch. Downstairs, Lina finished her evening tasks and prepared for another day of service, unaware that everything was about to change. The next morning brought a crisp clarity to Barrett's resolve. After a breakfast of eggs and bacon that Lina had prepared with her usual quiet efficiency, he settled into his study with pen and paper, determined to craft an advertisement that would attract the caliber of woman he sought. The study reflected the man who occupied it: rich mahogany paneling, shelves lined with books on ranching, business and literature, and a massive oak desk that had belonged to his father. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Barrett positioned himself at the desk, pulled out his finest stationery, and began to write. Prosperous rancher of excellent standing Sikhs. Refined lady of proper breeding for matrimony, he began, pausing to consider each word carefully. Must possess education, musical accomplishments, and social graces befitting the mistress of a grand estate. Preference given to candidates from established families with impeccable references, serious inquiries only. He added details about his holdings, the size of the ranch, the quality of his cattle, his standing in the community, painting a picture designed to attract women who understood the value of security and status. After several drafts, he was satisfied with the language. It was formal, dignified, and clear about his expectations. Barrett folded the advertisement carefully and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Austin American-Statesman, along with similar letters bound for newspapers in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. The finest families in Texas would read his proposition, and surely among them would be the woman destined to become the next Mrs. Langford. What he didn't notice was Lina entering the study to dust the bookshelves, moving with her characteristic silence as she tended to her tasks. She had perfected the art of being present but invisible, essential but unnoticed. It was a skill born of necessity. Servants who drew attention to themselves rarely kept their positions long. As Barrett gathered his correspondence and prepared to ride into town to post the letters, he left the final draft of his advertisement on the desk, weighted down by a crystal paperweight. Lina's eyes fell upon it as she reached to dust the surface, and despite herself, she found herself reading the carefully penned words. Each phrase struck her like a small blow. Refined lady of proper breeding. Musical accomplishments. Social graces. Established families. Every requirement seemed designed to exclude someone exactly like her, a woman whose family had lost their farm to creditors, whose education came from her mother's patient teaching rather than expensive schools, whose hands bore the calluses of honest work rather than the soft pallor of leisure. Lina's chest tightened as she absorbed the reality of Barrett's intentions. She had known, of course, that a man of his station would eventually remarry. She had even expected it, understanding her place in the natural order of things. But seeing his requirements spelled out so clearly, so completely opposite to everything she was, made her realize how foolish her quiet observations and growing feelings had been. She thought of the moments when their eyes had met briefly across a room, when she had caught him watching her tend to the horses with gentle hands, when she had imagined, just for a moment, that perhaps he saw her as more than simply the woman who kept his house clean and his meals prepared. Now she understood these moments for what they truly were, the romantic fantasies of a servant girl who had forgotten her place. With hands that trembled slightly, Lina carefully returned the advertisement to its exact position and continued her dusting. She moved through the familiar motions mechanically, her mind churning with emotions she couldn't fully name. Disappointment. Certainly, though she told herself she had no right to such feelings, sadness for dreams she now recognized as impossible, and underneath it all, a deeper ache that felt suspiciously like heartbreak. Barrett returned from town that afternoon with a satisfied air, having posted his advertisements and spoken with several prominent citizens about his intentions. Word would spread quickly through the proper social circles, and he anticipated receiving responses within the week. Lina served his dinner with her usual efficiency, placing the perfectly prepared roast beef and potatoes before him with steady hands that betrayed none of her inner turmoil. Barrett barely glanced up from his evening newspaper, already absorbed in reading about cattle prices and railroad developments. "Excellent meal, as always," he commented absently, and Lina murmured her thanks before retreating to the kitchen to clean the dishes. As she stood at the sink, scrubbing plates in water that had grown cold, Lina made her own quiet resolution. She would continue to serve the Langford household with the same dedication she had always shown. She would help prepare for the arrival of Barrett's prospective brides, ensuring the house was perfect for their visits. And she would guard her foolish heart against any further romantic notions about her employer. After all, she was just the maid, and some dreams were simply too far above one's station to ever come true. Outside, the Texas stars began to appear. In the darkening sky, witnesses to both grand ambitions and humble heartbreak, unfolding beneath the same vast heavens. Within a week, Barrett's mailbox overflowed with responses. Elegant envelopes bearing the seals of prominent families arrived daily, each containing carefully worded letters of introduction, accompanied by portraits painted in oils or the latest photographic studies. Barrett spread them across his desk, like a general planning a campaign, studying each candidate with the methodical approach he applied to purchasing prize cattle. Miss Charlotte Pemberton of Dallas presented impressive credentials. Daughter of a railroad magnate, educated at a prestigious finishing school in Virginia, accomplished at piano and French. Miss Victoria Ashworth from Houston boasted equally fine qualifications, with the added advantage of extensive travel throughout Europe and fluency in 3 languages. Miss Catherine Whitmore of San Antonio came recommended by no less than 5 society matrons who vouched for her refinement and domestic skills. Barrett scheduled the first visits carefully, spacing them to allow proper attention to each candidate while maintaining the dignity befitting such an important decision. The first to arrive would be Miss Pemberton, whose letter had impressed him with its elegant penmanship and thoughtful composition. On a bright Thursday morning, Barrett stood on his front porch watching a fine carriage approach through the gates of his ranch. The vehicle was clearly expensive, polished black lacquer with brass fittings that gleamed in the sunlight, pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that stepped with the precision of trained performers. Even from a distance, he could see this was a woman accustomed to the finest things in life. Miss Charlotte Pemberton emerged from the carriage like a vision from a ladies' magazine. She was perhaps 25, with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion and a traveling dress of deep blue silk that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. Her gloved hands moved with practiced grace as she adjusted her small hat and surveyed the ranch house with cool, appraising eyes. "Mr. Langford, I presume?" Her voice carried the cultivated accent of expensive education, each word precisely enunciated. "I am Miss Charlotte Pemberton. I trust my letter reached you in good order." Barrett stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him since childhood. "Miss Pemberton, welcome to the Langford Ranch. I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all. Papa arranged for his finest carriage, and the roads were quite acceptable." She accepted his offered arm as they climbed the porch steps, her touch light and proper. "What a charming home you have. So rustic." Something in her tone suggested that rustic wasn't entirely a compliment, but Barrett chose to take her words at face value. He escorted her into the parlor, where afternoon light illuminated Eleanor's portrait and the carefully arranged furniture that spoke of wealth and refinement. Lina appeared in the doorway, carrying a silver tea service that had been polished to mirror brightness. She moved with quiet efficiency, setting the elaborate tray on the mahogany side table and beginning to pour with steady hands. Barrett noticed how Miss Pemberton's eyes followed Lina's movements with the detached interest one might show watching a well-trained servant perform expected duties. "Thank you," Miss Pemberton said when Lina offered her a delicate china cup. But her gaze never quite focused on Lina's face. To her, the maid was simply part of the household furnishings, useful but unremarkable. As Lina bent to arrange the small silver spoons, her movement caused something to slip from her apron pocket, a small, embroidered handkerchief, simple but beautiful in its handmade perfection. Miss Pemberton's eyes immediately fixed on the dropped item with sharp attention. "Oh my!" she said with a laugh that tinkled like expensive crystal. "Your girl seems to have dropped something." She made no move to help retrieve it, simply watching with amused detachment as Lina quickly bent to recover the handkerchief, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Barrett found himself studying the small drama with unexpected interest. The handkerchief was clearly Lina's own work. He could see the careful stitches, the modest but lovely pattern of wildflowers embroidered around the edges. It spoke of quiet hours spent creating something beautiful from simple materials, of skills, passed down from mother to daughter, of finding grace in small things. In contrast, Miss Pemberton pulled a silk handkerchief from her own reticule, shaking it out with a flourish that seemed designed to emphasize its obvious expense and elaborate lace edges. The gesture felt calculated, a subtle way of highlighting the difference between what money could buy and what simple craftsmanship could create. "I do hope the girl isn't too clumsy," Miss Pemberton said, settling back in her chair with practiced poise. "Proper household management is so important, don't you think, Mr. Langford? One simply cannot maintain standards if the staff doesn't understand their place." Lina finished her tasks and withdrew from the room with downcast eyes, leaving Barrett alone with his first potential bride. He should have been pleased. Miss Pemberton was everything his advertisement had requested. Beautiful, refined, clearly from an excellent family, and possessed of all the social graces appropriate to her station. Yet, as they began their formal conversation about her accomplishments and interests, Barrett found his attention wandering to the brief interaction he had just witnessed. Something about the way Miss Pemberton had dismissed Lina's small embarrassment, the casual cruelty of pointing out the dropped handkerchief, left him feeling oddly unsettled. "I studied piano at the conservatory," Miss Pemberton was saying, her voice carrying the practiced modulation of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Perhaps you would enjoy hearing me play after dinner? I've mastered several pieces by Chopin that are considered quite challenging." "That would be delightful," Barrett replied, though his mind kept returning to the contrast between the two handkerchiefs, one representing wealth and status, the other humble craftsmanship and personal care. Miss Pemberton continued her recitation of accomplishments, her fluency in French, her extensive reading of classical literature, her skill at watercolor painting. Each achievement was real and impressive, yet something about the way she presented them felt like items being checked off a list rather than genuine expressions of passion or interest. When the conversation turned to ranch life, Miss Pemberton's responses became more careful, more calculated. She spoke of the importance of entertaining properly, of maintaining social connections with the right families, of ensuring that a ranch's reputation extended beyond mere financial success to encompass cultural refinement. "A woman's influence in such matters cannot be underestimated," she said, sipping her tea with practiced elegance. "The wife of a prominent rancher has a responsibility to elevate the entire community's standards. Social leadership, you might say." Barrett nodded appropriately, recognizing the truth in her words. This was exactly the kind of thinking he had expected from a suitable bride. An understanding of the broader social responsibilities that came with wealth and position. Yet something felt hollow about the conversation, as if they were discussing a business arrangement rather than a marriage. As the afternoon wore on, Barrett became increasingly aware of small details that hadn't troubled him during his correspondence with Miss Pemberton. The way she seemed to catalogue the furnishings and artwork with appraising eyes, how she asked pointed questions about the size of his holdings and the extent of his investments, the subtle manner in which she positioned herself in the most flattering light, both literally and figuratively. When Lina returned to collect the tea service, Miss Pemberton barely acknowledged her presence, continuing her conversation without pause. Barrett found himself watching Lina's quiet efficiency, the careful way she handled the delicate china, the unobtrusive grace with which she managed her tasks. Still, he reminded himself, this was exactly the kind of discerning nature a mistress of a grand estate would need to possess. Miss Pemberton was everything he had asked for, and more. If something felt missing, it was likely his own unrealistic expectations, not any fault in this accomplished young woman. Accomplishments and interests, Barrett found his attention wandering to the brief interaction he had just witnessed. Something about the way Miss Pemberton had dismissed Lina's small embarrassment, the casual cruelty of pointing out the dropped handkerchief, left him feeling oddly unsettled. Still, he reminded himself, this was exactly the kind of discerning nature a mistress of a grand estate would need to possess. Over the following weeks, the Langford Ranch transformed into something resembling a grand social experiment. Barrett had extended invitations to 6 of the most promising candidates, and they arrived in waves of silk, perfume, and barely concealed ambition. Each woman brought her own strategy for capturing the wealthy rancher's attention, and the house buzzed with an energy that felt both exciting and exhausting. Miss Victoria Ashworth arrived on a Tuesday morning in a carriage even more elaborate than Miss Pemberton's, accompanied by her personal maid, and enough luggage to suggest she planned an extended campaign. She was a striking redhead with emerald eyes and a laugh that carried through the house like music. Within hours of her arrival, she had charmed Barrett with stories of her travels through Italy and France, demonstrating her fluency in both languages while serving tea with continental flair. "I find that travel broadens one's perspective so wonderfully," she said, adjusting the magnificent pearl necklace that graced her throat. A gift from her late grandmother, she explained, though Barrett couldn't help noticing how perfectly it complemented her green silk dress. "A woman of breeding should understand the wider world, don't you think? It makes for such interesting conversation at dinner parties." Miss Catherine Whitmore took a different approach entirely. Where Miss Pemberton emphasized social graces and Miss Ashworth showcased worldly sophistication, Miss Whitmore positioned herself as the practical choice. She arrived with letters of recommendation from prominent cattle ranchers' wives, testimonials to her skills in household management and her understanding of ranch life. "I've overseen the operation of my father's estate since Mother's passing," she informed Barrett during their first formal conversation. 12 servants, entertaining for 60 guests, managing household accounts down to the penny. "I understand that a rancher's wife must be more than ornamental. She must be a true partner in the enterprise." By the third week, Barrett found himself caught in an elaborate dance of courtship that felt increasingly choreographed. Each morning brought carefully planned encounters, Miss Pemberton playing intricate piano pieces in the parlor, Miss Ashworth reading French poetry aloud in the garden, Miss Whitmore demonstrating her knowledge of cattle breeds during tours of the ranch. Each woman seemed determined to prove she possessed exactly what Barrett had advertised for, performing their qualifications like actors in a well-rehearsed play. The competition between them was subtle but unmistakable. Miss Pemberton made pointed comments about the importance of natural refinement versus acquired polish. Miss Ashworth casually mentioned the size of her father's railroad holdings and the influential connections such wealth provided. Miss Whitmore spoke often of practical skills and the value of a wife who understood the realities of ranch management rather than mere social display. Throughout this elaborate courtship ritual, Lina moved through the house like a ghost. Her workload had tripled with the arrival of the guests. Additional meals to prepare, rooms to clean, clothes to launder and press, endless tea services and social gatherings to orchestrate. She rose before dawn and worked until well past midnight, ensuring that every detail met the exacting standards the situation demanded. Barrett's potential brides treated her with the casual indifference reserved for useful furniture. They issued commands without please or thank you, criticized the temperature of bathwater or the pressing of a dress without considering that Lina was doing the work of 3 servants. When Miss Ashworth's pearl necklace went missing for several hours, she immediately accused Lina of theft, demanding that Barrett search the maid's quarters before the jewelry was eventually found tangled in Miss Ashworth's own travel bags. "One simply cannot be too careful with servants," Miss Ashworth explained, without a trace of embarrassment at her false accusation. "They see such beautiful things daily, and temptation can be quite overwhelming for people of their background." Barrett had watched this exchange from his study doorway, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with what he witnessed. The pearl necklace incident was merely the most dramatic example of a pattern he was beginning to recognize. His potential brides seemed to view Lina not as a person deserving of basic courtesy, but as a convenient target for displaying their own superiority. Yet when he observed Lina during these trying moments, he saw something remarkable. Despite the constant pressure, the unfair accusations, and the overwhelming workload, she maintained her dignity and competence. She never responded with anger or defended herself beyond simple, truthful statements. Instead, she absorbed each slight with quiet grace, continuing to perform her duties with the same careful attention she had always shown. One evening, as Barrett sat in his study reviewing cattle breeding records, he became aware of soft humming coming from the kitchen. Rising quietly, he moved toward the sound and found Lina working by lamplight, kneading bread dough for the next day's breakfast. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms made strong by honest work, and her dark hair had escaped its pins to frame her face in soft tendrils. She hummed an old Mexican lullaby her mother had taught her, the melody threading through the kitchen like a gentle blessing. Her hands worked the dough with practiced rhythm, and Barrett found himself mesmerized by the simple beauty of the scene, a woman creating something nourishing and necessary, finding music in the midst of labor. When she noticed him in the doorway, Lina stopped humming abruptly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Langford. I didn't realize I was being so loud." "Please don't apologize," Barrett said, stepping into the warm circle of lamplight. "That was a beautiful song. I've never heard it before. My mother used to sing it when she baked," Lina explained, her voice soft with memory. "She said bread needed music to rise properly." Something in her gentle explanation touched Barrett in a way that all the accomplished performances of his potential brides had not. Here was authenticity without calculation, beauty without artifice, wisdom passed down through generations of women who understood that creating a home required both skill and love. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. She was. Lina's eyes grew distant. "She taught me that there's dignity in honest work, that we honor God by doing our best, no matter what the task." Barrett found himself wishing he could extend this conversation, but the impropriety of a wealthy rancher talking intimately with his maid was too obvious to ignore. Instead, he simply nodded and withdrew to his study, leaving Lina to her bread and her lullabies. As he returned to his paperwork, Barrett realized that the simple scene in the kitchen had affected him more deeply than all the elaborate entertainments his suitors had provided. But such thoughts were dangerous territory for a man in his position, and he firmly redirected his attention to the business at hand. The encounter in the kitchen marked a subtle shift in Barrett's awareness, though he tried to convince himself otherwise. Over the following days, he found his attention drawn to moments he had previously overlooked. The quiet efficiency with which Lina managed the increasingly complex household, the gentle way she spoke to the horses when she thought no one was watching, the small acts of kindness she showed to the ranch hands who brought news from the outer pastures. It was during one of these unguarded observations that Barrett discovered something that surprised him. He had retreated to his study after a particularly trying afternoon of formal conversation with Miss Whitmore about the proper management of household budgets, when movement in the garden caught his eye. Through his window, he could see Lina kneeling beside a patch of earth near the kitchen door, her work dress protected by a worn apron. She was tending to a small collection of plants, herbs and wildflowers that had somehow found their way into neat rows, despite the chaos of recent weeks. Barrett watched as she carefully watered each plant, her movements gentle and purposeful. When she reached a struggling rosebush that had been neglected since Eleanor's death, she spent extra time loosening the soil around its base and speaking to it in soft, encouraging tones. "There now," he heard her murmur through the open window. "You just need a little attention, don't you?" "We all do." What struck Barrett most was not the small garden itself, but the expression of pure contentment on Lina's face as she worked. Here, away from the demands of his potential brides and the pressures of her overwhelming duties, she seemed to find a peace that none of the elaborate entertainments in his parlor had managed to create. Later that evening, Barrett made his way to his study to review some contracts when he noticed something unusual on his desk. Beside his leather-bound ledger sat a small object he hadn't placed there, a delicately carved wooden bird, no larger than his thumb. The craftsmanship was remarkable, despite its humble materials, with tiny feathers etched into the soft wood, and eyes that seemed almost alive. He picked up the carving, turning it over in his hands. The wood was smooth from careful sanding, and he could see the marks where a sharp knife had patiently shaped each detail. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a work of art created not for display or sale, but for the pure joy of making something lovely from ordinary materials. Barrett found himself wondering who had made it and why it had appeared on his desk. The answer came the next morning when he saw Lina dusting the study shelves, her movements careful around his papers and books. She glanced at the wooden bird with unmistakable recognition, and he realized she must have seen him working on it. During quiet evening hours, when his official duties were finished, "This is remarkable workmanship," he said, holding up the carving. "Do you know who made it?" Lina's cheeks colored slightly. Yes, sir. I saw you carving it some evenings. When I came to bank the fire, I thought perhaps you'd like it on your desk, but if it's presumptuous of me, you've seen me carving." Barrett was genuinely surprised. He had thought his evening hobby was private, something he did in solitude when the pressures of ranch management and social obligations became too heavy. "I didn't mean to intrude," Lina said quickly. "It's just that when I come to tend the fire, I sometimes see you working by lamplight. You look so peaceful when you're creating something beautiful." Her observation touched something deep within. Barrett. Few people had ever seen past his role as wealthy rancher and community leader to recognize the man who found solace in simple craftsmanship. Eleanor had never shown interest in his whittling, considering it an undignified hobby for a man of his standing. "I started carving when I was young," he found himself explaining. "My grandfather taught me. He said a man's hands needed to create as well as acquire." "He sounds wise," Lina said softly. "My father used to say something similar about working with wood. He made furniture for our little house. Nothing fancy, but everything was made with love." The conversation felt dangerously intimate, crossing boundaries that Barrett knew he should maintain. Yet something about Lina's understanding of his need to create, her recognition of the peace it brought him, made him reluctant to end the moment. "I should let you continue your work," he said finally, though he made no move to leave the study. "In course, sir." But Lina hesitated at the doorway, turning back with a shy smile. "The bird is lovely. I hope you'll keep carving. The world needs more beautiful things in it." After she left, Barrett sat holding the wooden bird, thinking about her words. In all the elaborate discussions with his potential brides about art and culture, none had recognized his personal need to create. They spoke of appreciating beauty as consumers, not as people who understood the deep satisfaction of bringing something new into existence with their own hands. That afternoon, while Miss Pemberton entertained the group with a complex piano sonata, Barrett found his mind wandering to the conversation in his study. Through the parlor window, he could see Lina hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her movements efficient but graceful as she transformed a mundane chore into something almost dance-like. The contrast between the two scenes struck him powerfully. In the parlor, Miss Pemberton performed with technical perfection, her fingers flying over the keys in a display designed to impress and charm. Outside, Lina simply went about her work with natural grace, finding rhythm and beauty in necessity itself. Barrett realized he was seeing two very different approaches to living, one that sought to display accomplishment and refinement, another that found contentment in simple tasks well done. Both had their place in the world, but only one felt authentic to him. As the piano music swelled to its dramatic conclusion, Barrett applauded appropriately and offered the expected compliments. But his thoughts remained with the woman hanging clothes in the afternoon sunshine, who had seen something in his evening carving that spoke to her understanding of beauty and peace. The opportunity for a deeper conversation came unexpectedly. On a Thursday afternoon, when Barrett's potential brides had departed for a shopping expedition to the nearest town, Miss Pemberton had organized the outing with military precision, declaring that they simply must visit the local dressmaker and milliner to ensure their wardrobes remained appropriate for ranch social life. Barrett had politely declined their invitation to escort them, claiming pressing business matters that required his attention. In truth, he welcomed the temporary respite from the constant performance of courtship. The house felt different without the rustle of silk skirts and the carefully modulated conversations designed to showcase each woman's particular accomplishments. For the first time in weeks, Barrett could hear the natural sounds of his ranch. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, horses nickering in the corral, the gentle creak of the windmill that pumped water from the deep well his grandfather had dug. He found himself drawn to the small garden where he had observed Lina working. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended plants, and he could see evidence of her patient care in every thriving herb and flower. The struggling rosebush had responded to her attention with new growth, tiny buds promising future blooms. Lina was there, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, gently tying their growing stems to wooden stakes she had fashioned from scraps of lumber. She worked with the focused concentration of someone who understood that small acts of care could mean the difference between abundance and failure. "Your garden is flourishing," Barrett said, announcing his presence so as not to startle her. Lina looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon light. "Mr. Langford, I hope you don't mind that I planted here. Mrs. Patterson said it would be acceptable, but if you'd prefer, I move it." "Not at all," Barrett said quickly. "Eleanor always intended to have a kitchen garden, but somehow other priorities took precedence. I'm glad to see the space finally serving its purpose." He settled onto a wooden crate that someone had placed nearby, clearly used as a makeshift seat during garden work. The informality felt strange but welcome after weeks of formal parlor conversations. "My mother always said that land wants to give life," Lina said, returning to her work with the tomatoes. "You just have to listen to what it needs and provide what you can." "Wise advice. Do you miss having your own land to tend?" Lina's hands stilled for a moment. "Every day. But I'm grateful for this small space. It reminds me of home." Something in her voice prompted Barrett to ask, "Tell me about your family's farm. What was it like?" "Small," Lina said with a gentle smile. "Nothing like this grand place, just enough acres to grow what we needed and a little extra to sell at market. Papa raised a few head of cattle and Mother kept chickens. I had my own little plot where I grew vegetables and flowers all mixed together, much to Mother's amusement." Mixed together. Most people keep vegetables and flowers separate, but I liked the way they looked together. Bright marigolds next to green beans, morning glories climbing over the bean poles, herbs scattered throughout. Papa said my garden looked like a crazy quilt, but it produced more food than any neat, orderly plot had a right to, Barrett found himself genuinely curious about this unconventional approach. How did that work? The flowers attracted bees for pollination, and some of them kept harmful insects away from the vegetables. The different plants helped each other grow stronger. Lina's voice grew animated as she spoke about something she clearly loved. Nature doesn't organize itself into neat rows, so why should a garden? The philosophy struck Barrett as both practical and profound. Here was someone who understood that beauty and utility could enhance each other rather than competing for space. "I would have liked to see that garden," he said. "It was nothing fancy," Lina replied, but her eyes held the warmth of cherished memory. Just a place where things grew together in harmony. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching a bee work its way methodically through the herb blossoms. Barrett realized this was the most relaxed he had felt in weeks. "What would you plant if you could have any garden you wanted?" he asked. Lina considered the question seriously. "I would want fruit trees, apple and pear, maybe a peach tree if the climate suited, vegetables for eating and preserving, herbs for cooking and healing, and flowers everywhere because life is hard enough without beauty to soften it." "That sounds like a perfect garden." "What about you?" Lina asked, then seemed to realize the presumption of her question. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry." "Please," Barrett said. "I'm enjoying this conversation more than any I've had in recent memory." Lina smiled, encouraged by his sincerity. "Do you have favorite plants or flowers?" Barrett had to think about it. No one had ever asked him such a question. "I suppose I've never considered it." Eleanor preferred formal gardens, geometric patterns, imported roses, everything precisely arranged. I admired them, but they never seemed to invite lingering. But what draws your eye when you're riding across your land? What makes you slow your horse to look more closely? The question revealed how little Barrett had considered his own preferences separate from social expectations. "Wildflowers," he said after a moment, "the ones that bloom along the creek beds in spring. Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets and little white flowers whose names I don't know." "Mexican buckeye," Lina said with obvious pleasure. "The white ones. With the sweet fragrance. They bloom early, before the heat sets in. You know them? I love those creek-bottom meadows. Sometimes in early morning when my chores allow, I walk down there just to see what's blooming. It's like having a conversation with the land itself." Barrett understood exactly what she meant, though he had never heard the feeling expressed so. Oh, clearly. Those solitary morning rides had always been his most peaceful times, moments when he felt connected to something larger than business ledgers and social obligations. "Perhaps you could show me your favorite spots sometime," he found himself saying, then immediately wondered at his boldness. "I would like that," Lina said simply, her honesty matching his own. A breeze stirred through the garden, carrying the scent of herbs and the distant sound of the returning carriages. The spell of the afternoon was breaking, and both of them seemed to recognize that their informal conversation would soon give way to the formal requirements of Barrett's courtship. "I should prepare refreshments for the ladies," Lina said, rising gracefully from her kneeling position. "Of course." Barrett stood as well, reluctant to end the encounter but knowing propriety demanded it. As Lina gathered her gardening tools, and Barrett noticed she handled each implement with the same care she gave to everything else, cleaning the dirt from the small spade, coiling the twine neatly, ensuring everything was properly maintained for future use. "Thank you for sharing your garden wisdom," he said. "I'll look at wildflowers differently now." "Thank you for asking about it," Lina replied. "It's been a long time since anyone wanted to hear about such simple things." As she walked toward the house, Barrett remained in the garden for a few more minutes, absorbing the peace of the space she had created. For the first time since beginning his search for a bride, he found himself questioning whether what he thought he wanted was truly what would make him happy. Barrett's peaceful afternoon in the garden proved to be the calm before a particularly intense storm. Upon learning of his potential bride's return from town, he felt obligated to host a formal dinner party showcasing each woman's accomplishments. For several prominent neighbors, the event would serve multiple purposes, allowing his guests to display their social graces, demonstrating to the community his serious intentions regarding marriage, and providing him with the opportunity to observe how each candidate handled the responsibilities of hostessing. The preparation consumed 3 days of frenzied activity. Miss Pemberton took charge of the musical entertainment, arranging an elaborate program that would feature each woman's particular talents. Miss Ashworth coordinated the menu with input from her European travels, insisting on several courses that would demonstrate sophistication and worldly knowledge. Miss Whitmore supervised the table settings and floral arrangements, determined to prove her practical skills in household management. Throughout these preparations, Lina worked with quiet efficiency to bring their grand visions to life. She polished silver until it gleamed like mirrors, pressed linens to crisp perfection, and somehow managed to procure the exotic ingredients Miss Ashworth's menu required, despite the ranch's remote location. Barrett watched her navigate the competing demands and barely concealed rivalry among his guests with diplomatic grace, somehow satisfying each woman's particular requirements without allowing any to feel slighted. The evening of the dinner party, the Langford ranch house blazed with light from every window. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across the polished floors, and arrangements of roses from the formal garden filled the air with heavy perfume. Barrett's guests had spared no expense in their attire. Miss Pemberton wore a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her sapphire jewelry. Miss Ashworth appeared in emerald green that matched her eyes and enhanced her magnificent pearls, while Miss Whitmore chose understated elegance in ivory with tasteful gold accessories. The dinner began with apparent success. Conversation flowed smoothly around topics designed to showcase each woman's education and refinement. Miss Pemberton discussed recent developments in classical music with the banker's wife. Miss Ashworth regaled the cattle baron's daughter with stories of Parisian fashion. Miss Whitmore engaged the railroad executive's spouse in practical matters of household economy and social responsibility. Barrett played his role as gracious host, ensuring that wine glasses remained filled and conversation never lagged. Yet he found himself increasingly aware of the performance aspect of the evening. Every comment seemed calculated for effect, every gesture designed to impress. Even the laughter felt rehearsed, timed for maximum social impact. The first crack in the evening's facade appeared during the fourth course, when Lina approached the table carrying a crystal serving bowl filled with glazed carrots. As she leaned forward to place the dish near Miss Ashworth, her sleeve briefly brushed against the woman's wine glass. The glass tipped, sending burgundy wine cascading across the white tablecloth and splashing onto Miss Ashworth's emerald gown. The accident was minor, easily cleaned and quickly forgotten under normal circumstances. But the tension and competition of the evening transformed it into something more significant. "You clumsy fool!" Miss Ashworth exclaimed, her cultivated composure vanishing in an instant. "Look what you've done to my dress. This gown cost more than you earn in a year." The dining room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the scene unfolding at the head of the table, where Lina stood frozen with the serving bowl still in her hands, her face flushed with mortification. "I'm so terribly sorry," Lina began, setting down the bowl and reaching for her napkin. "Please, let me help clean." "Don't touch it!" Miss Ashworth snapped, pushing back from the table with such force that her chair nearly toppled. "You've done quite enough damage already." Barrett watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He could see that the accident was exactly that. An unfortunate but innocent mishap of the type that occurred regularly in even the finest households. Yet, Miss Ashworth's reaction was disproportionate to the offense, revealing something ugly beneath her polished exterior. "Victoria, please," Miss Pemberton said with practiced diplomacy. "I'm sure it was unintentional. Perhaps if we—" "Unintentional?" Miss Ashworth's voice rose to a pitch that carried clearly to the kitchen. "Look at her. She can barely manage a simple serving task. How can we trust such incompetence in a proper household?" What happened next surprised everyone, including Barrett himself. Instead of apologizing further or withdrawing as protocol demanded, Lina straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Miss Ashworth with quiet dignity. "You're absolutely right," she said calmly. "I should have been more careful. However, if you would permit me, I know how to remove wine stains from silk without damaging the fabric. My mother taught me techniques that might save your beautiful dress." The offer was gracious, practical, and delivered without a trace of the defensiveness Miss Ashworth's attack deserved. It demonstrated both humility and competence, acknowledging the mistake while offering genuine assistance. Miss Ashworth stared at Lina for a long moment, her face cycling through expressions of anger, surprise, and something that might have been grudging respect. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see how she would respond to such unexpected grace under pressure. But before Miss Ashworth could reply, the crystal champagne glass at her place setting, perhaps loosened by her violent movement from the table, chose that moment to topple and shatter against her china plate. The sound rang through the dining room like a gunshot, and suddenly the focus shifted from wine stains to broken crystals scattered across expensive china. Barrett found himself studying the fragments of his grandmother's crystal while his guests fluttered with concern and offers of assistance. The glass had been part of a set that had graced Langford family celebrations for 3 generations, each piece treasured for its beauty and its history. Now it lay in pieces, destroyed not by honest accident, but by an outburst of temper over a minor mishap. In that moment, the symbolism struck him powerfully. The crystal represented the kind of perfection he thought he wanted. Beautiful, valuable, admired by all who saw it. But it was also fragile, requiring careful handling and constant vigilance to preserve. One moment of carelessness or strong emotion could destroy it completely. Meanwhile, Lina quietly swept up the crystal fragments with steady hands, her competence and grace undiminished by the evening's trials. She had been attacked unfairly, humiliated in front of prominent guests, yet she continued to serve with dignity and skill. Her response to adversity revealed character that no amount of breeding or education could create. As the evening finally drew to a close and his guests departed with elaborate thanks and promises of reciprocal invitations, Barrett found himself alone in his study with a tumbler of whiskey and a head full of contradictory thoughts. The dinner had been a social success by every conventional measure, yet it had left him feeling more confused about his choice of bride than ever before. The broken crystal sat on his desk, gathered carefully by Lina, despite his protests that he would handle it himself. Looking at the fragments in the lamplight, Barrett began to understand that what he had mistaken for perfection might actually be a beautiful but ultimately fragile illusion. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Barrett finally abandoned his attempt to sleep. The evening's events churned through his mind like a stubborn mill wheel, grinding the same thoughts over and over without resolution. The image of Miss Ashworth's twisted face, the sound of shattering crystal, and most persistently, the memory of Lina's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation, all of it refused to settle into the orderly conclusions he desperately needed. He pulled on his robe and padded barefoot down the carpeted stairs, seeking the solitude of his study, where he might finally organize his thoughts into some semblance of clarity. But as he passed the kitchen, the warm glow of lamplight stopped him short. Someone was awake, moving about in the soft circle of illumination. Lina stood at the large wooden table in the center of the kitchen, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and her work dress replaced by a simple white nightgown covered with a worn shawl. Her hands worked steadily in a large mixing bowl, and the rich scent of yeast and flour filled the air with promises of morning bread. "I'm sorry," Barrett said quietly from the doorway. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Lina looked up with startled eyes, her cheeks flushing at being discovered in such informal attire. "Mr. Langford, I should be the one apologizing. I know it's quite late, but after this evening, I found I couldn't sleep and tomorrow's bread won't bake itself. Please, don't let me interrupt your work." Barrett stepped into the kitchens, warmth drawn by something he couldn't quite name. "I couldn't sleep either." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the social conventions that normally governed their interactions rendered useless by the intimate hour and informal setting. Lina returned to her kneading with slightly self-conscious movements, while Barrett found himself genuinely fascinated by the process. "My mother used to bake bread at night when she was troubled," Lina said softly, her hands finding their rhythm. Again, she said the work calmed her mind and the rising dough gave her hope for tomorrow. "Wise woman," Barrett said, settling onto a wooden stool near the table. "What troubles keep you awake tonight?" Lina's hands paused in their work. "I fear I embarrassed you this evening, in front of your guests and the ladies who might become your wife. I should have been more careful." "The accident wasn't your fault," Barrett said firmly. "Anyone could have bumped that glass." "But I did bump it, and Miss Ashworth was right. I am clumsy sometimes when I'm tired. The past weeks have been—" She trailed off, clearly reluctant to complain about her increased workload. "Exhausting?" Barrett supplied. "I've watched you manage 3 times your normal duties without a word of complaint. If anyone should apologize, it's me for not hiring additional help." Lina looked up in surprise. "You noticed." "I notice more than you might think." The admission came out more intimate than Barrett had intended, but the hour and the setting seemed to demand honesty. "I've seen how hard you work, how graciously you handle every impossible request. What happened tonight only proved your character, not your incompetence." The dough in Lina's hands had reached perfect smoothness, but she continued kneading, as if the motion itself provided comfort. Miss Ashworth was angry, and rightfully so. That dress was beautiful. Miss Ashworth's dress can be cleaned or replaced, Barrett said. Her behavior, on the other hand, revealed something that can't be so easily mended. Lina shaped the dough into a smooth ball and placed it in a greased bowl, covering it with a clean cloth. The simple domestic ritual felt sacred in the lamplight, a small act of faith that tomorrow would bring fresh bread and new possibilities. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "I was about to make some for myself." Barrett knew he should decline, and returned to his room. The impropriety of sharing midnight coffee with his maid would scandalize any of the society matrons who had dined at his table earlier. Yet something about Lina's quiet presence felt more genuine than any conversation he'd had in weeks. "I'd like that very much," he said. Lina moved about the kitchen with efficient grace, grinding coffee beans and setting the pot to brew on the still warm stove. She cut thick slices from yesterday's bread and set out butter and honey, creating a simple feast from humble ingredients. "This is my favorite time of day," she said, as they waited for the coffee to brew. "When all the work is done and the house is quiet, it feels peaceful." "I understand that feeling," Barrett said. "Some of my best thinking happens in these quiet hours. Is that when you do your carving?" The question caught him off guard. They had never discussed his evening hobby beyond their brief conversation in the study. "How did you know about that?" "I see the light in your study window from my room," Lina explained, pouring coffee into two mismatched cups. "Sometimes when I can't sleep, I notice you're still awake. And I've seen the wood shavings in the fireplace the next morning when I clean the grate." Barrett accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by how much attention she paid to his habits. "It helps me think. There's something about creating something beautiful with your hands that clarifies the mind." My father felt the same way about his carpentry work. He said wood had its own wisdom. You had to listen to what it wanted to become, rather than forcing your own ideas upon it. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and sharing the simple bread. Barrett found himself studying Lina's face. In the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the gentle curve of her mouth. Without the severe hairstyle her work required, she looked younger, softer, more approachable. "May I ask you something?" Lina said hesitantly. "Of course. Are you happy? With the courtship, I mean. Do any of the ladies make you feel content?" The question was deeply personal, perhaps inappropriate, but Barrett found himself wanting to answer honestly. "They're all accomplished women. Any man would be fortunate to marry one of them." "That's not what I asked." Barrett set down his coffee cup and considered his words carefully. "No," he said finally. "I'm not happy. I thought I knew what I wanted in a wife, but now I find myself questioning everything. What did you think you wanted? Refinement? Education? Social graces? Someone who could step into Eleanor's role and maintain the family's position in society." He paused, then added quietly, "Someone who looked good on paper. And now?" Barrett met her eyes across the simple wooden table. "Now I think I want something different entirely, someone genuine, someone who finds joy in simple things and treats all people with kindness, someone who understands that a home should be a place of peace, not performance." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither quite dared to acknowledge. Lina's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "I should probably let you get some rest," Barrett said reluctantly, though he made no move to rise from his seat. "Probably," Lina agreed, but she didn't move either. They sat in the golden circle of lamplight, surrounded by the scents of rising bread and fresh coffee, while the rest of the world slept. For this brief moment, the barriers between wealthy rancher and humble maid seemed less important than the simple human connection they had discovered in the quiet hours of night. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. promising a new day with all its complications and social requirements. But for now, in the warm sanctuary of the midnight kitchen, Barrett felt more at peace than he had in months. The week following the disastrous dinner party brought a flurry of activity as Barrett's courtship entered its final phase. Social expectations and family pressure demanded that he make a decision soon. His prolonged bachelorhood was becoming a subject of speculation throughout the county, and several of his potential brides had begun receiving other offers of marriage. Barrett found himself in his study on a grey Thursday morning, surrounded by letters, portraits, and detailed notes about each candidate's qualifications. The methodical approach that had served him well in cattle breeding and business negotiations felt increasingly inadequate when applied to matters of the heart. Yet he persisted in trying to organize his thoughts logically. After much deliberation, he had narrowed his choice to 3 finalists: Miss Charlotte Pemberton, Miss Victoria Ashworth, and Miss Catherine Whitmore. Each represented a different aspect of what society considered an ideal rancher's wife, and each possessed qualities that would enhance the Langford family's standing in the community. In his desk drawer lay Eleanor's silver locket, the one she had worn on their wedding day and treasured throughout their brief marriage. Inside, a tiny portrait of Eleanor herself gazed out with the gentle smile that had first captured his heart. Barrett had been considering which of his remaining candidates should receive this precious family heirloom as an engagement gift, a gesture that would symbolize not just his choice of bride, but his commitment to continuing the Langford legacy. Miss Pemberton remained the most traditionally accomplished candidate. Her musical skills were undeniable, her social connections impeccable, and her understanding of proper etiquette flawless. She would grace any drawing room with elegance and could be trusted to handle the complex social obligations that came with being a prominent rancher's wife. Yet Barrett found their conversations increasingly predictable, following well-worn paths of acceptable topics without ever touching on anything genuinely personal or revealing. Miss Ashworth brought worldly sophistication and valuable family connections in the railroad industry. Her travels had given her a cosmopolitan perspective that would impress visiting dignitaries and business associates. However, the wine incident had revealed a temperament that concerned Barrett. Her treatment of Lina had shown a casual cruelty that suggested how she might behave toward anyone she considered beneath her station. Miss Whitmore offered practical competence and genuine understanding of ranch life. She had grown up managing a large household and understood the realities of agricultural business in ways the other candidates did not. Her approach was refreshingly direct, without pretense or artificial refinement. Yet Barrett wondered if their partnership would become merely a business arrangement, efficient but lacking in the deeper emotional connection he had hoped to find. As he sat weighing these considerations, Barrett became aware of voices in the hallway outside his study. The 3 women were engaged in what sounded like casual conversation, but their words carried clearly through the partially open door. "Really, Charlotte, you must see that your musical accomplishments, while charming, hardly qualify you to manage an enterprise of this magnitude," Miss Whitmore was saying with brittle politeness. "A ranch wife needs practical skills, not parlor entertainment. How quaint that you should think management ability supersedes breeding and refinement," Miss Pemberton replied coolly. "Surely Mr. Langford understands that his wife's primary role will be social leadership, not bookkeeping." "Social leadership requires more than playing piano and speaking French," Miss Ashworth interjected. "One needs connections, influence, the ability to move in sophisticated circles. Local society matrons are hardly equipped to guide a man of Barrett's standing." Barrett found himself listening with growing discomfort as the conversation continued. Each woman systematically dismissed the other's qualifications while promoting her own advantages. What struck him most forcefully was how they spoke of marriage to him as if it were a business acquisition. a strategic alliance designed to advance their own positions rather than create a partnership based on mutual affection and respect. Of course, we all understand the unfortunate reality of his current household arrangements, Miss Ashworth continued with obvious distaste. That Mexican girl simply must go. She's entirely too familiar with her betters, and after that embarrassing display at dinner, keeping her would reflect poorly on any new mistress of the house. Absolutely, Miss Pemberton agreed. A proper lady's maid from back east would be essential, someone who understands her place and maintains appropriate boundaries. The entire staff will need restructuring, Miss Whitmore added pragmatically. Most of these ranch hands have been here too long and grown too comfortable with informality. A wife needs servants who respect authority. Barrett felt his jaw tighten as he listened to them casually discuss dismissing Lina and reorganizing his household to suit their preferences. They spoke of people who had served his family faithfully for years, as if they were inconvenient furniture to be replaced at will. The conversation moved on to other topics, which guest rooms would need redecorating, how the parlor might be rearranged to better showcase musical performances, whether the dining room was adequate for the kind of entertaining they envisioned. Each suggestion involved erasing some trace of Eleanor's influence or Barrett's personal preferences in favor of their own vision of what the Langford Ranch should become. Barrett quietly closed his study door and returned to his desk, but concentration proved impossible. The silver locket seemed to reproach him with Eleanor's gentle smile, reminding him of how different his first marriage had been. Eleanor had never spoken of changing his household or dismissing his staff. She had accepted his life as she found it and worked to enhance rather than replace what already existed. More disturbing was the casual assumption that Lina should be dismissed simply because she had become too familiar. Barrett realized that what they saw as inappropriate familiarity, he had come to value as genuine human connection. Lina's ability to speak honestly, to see past his wealth and position to the man beneath, had become precious to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He opened the locket and studied Eleanor's portrait more carefully than he had in months. What would she think of his current situation? Eleanor had possessed genuine kindness. She would never have suggested dismissing a faithful servant for minor infractions or treated anyone with the casual cruelty he had witnessed from his current candidates. The realization struck him with uncomfortable clarity. None of his three finalists possessed the essential quality that had made Eleanor truly special, a generous heart that treated all people with dignity and respect. They might enhance his social standing and manage his household efficiently, but they would not create the kind of home where peace and genuine happiness could flourish. Barrett closed the locket with a decisive snap and locked it back in his desk drawer. Whatever decision he made about marriage, it would not be based solely on social expectations or family tradition. He owed it to Eleanor's memory, to his own happiness, and perhaps most importantly, to the woman he eventually married, to choose. With his heart as well as his head, outside his window, he could see Lina hanging laundry on the line, her movements graceful and efficient as she transformed a mundane chore into something almost dance-like. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of emotions he wasn't quite ready to examine, but one thing had become clear. The conversation he had just overheard had helped him understand exactly what kind of woman he did not want to marry. The discovery came on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon when the house felt particularly oppressive under grey skies and the weight of unresolved decisions. Barrett had retreated to the stables to check on a mare approaching foaling, seeking refuge from the increasingly tense atmosphere among his three remaining candidates. Each woman seemed to sense that a final choice was imminent, and their competition had taken on an edge that made ordinary conversation feel like navigating a minefield. Meanwhile, in the house, Miss Pemberton had been searching for her missing embroidery scissors when she discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the small storage room where Lina kept her cleaning supplies, she found a carefully folded piece of paper that bore Barrett's name in Lina's careful handwriting. The letter had never been sent. Indeed, it had never been intended for anyone's eyes but the writer's own. It was the kind of outpouring that comes from a heart too full to contain its feelings any longer, written during one of those sleepless nights when emotion overwhelmed prudence. Miss Pemberton unfolded the paper with trembling hands, her pulse quickening as she realized what she had discovered. The words were simple but devastating in their honesty. "My dear Mr. Langford," the letter began, "I know I have no right to write these words, and I pray you will never read them. But my heart is so full of feelings I cannot express that I must put them somewhere, even if only on paper to be burned when dawn comes." The letter continued with careful penmanship that spoke of long practice and deep thought. "I have watched you these past months as you seek a wife worthy of your position, and I have seen the loneliness in your eyes that no amount of accomplished conversation seems to ease. I wish I could tell you that what you seek is not found in musical accomplishments or social graces, but in the simple meeting of two hearts that understand each other." Lina had written of their conversation in the garden, of her appreciation for his wood carving, of the way his face changed when he spoke of wildflowers or worked with the horses. She had described seeing past his wealth and position to the gentle man who needed someone to understand his quiet nature rather than change it. "I know I am only your maid," the letter concluded, "and that my feelings are inappropriate and impossible, but if I could have one wish, it would be that you might find someone who sees you as I do, not as a wealthy rancher to be conquered, but as a good man deserving of love that asks nothing more than the chance to make you truly happy." Miss Pemberton read the letter twice, her initial shock giving way to calculating fury. Here was ammunition that could destroy her most dangerous rival. Not one of the other accomplished ladies, but the servant who had somehow captured Barrett's attention without anyone realizing the extent of her presumption. She found Miss Ashworth and Miss Whitmore in the parlor, engaged in forced conversation over afternoon tea. Without preamble, she placed the letter on the table between them. "I believe we have been overlooking the most serious threat to our interests," she announced with brittle satisfaction. Both women read the letter in silence, their expressions shifting from confusion to outrage to cold determination. Miss Ashworth spoke first, her voice tight with indignation. The audacity of that girl! To harbor such inappropriate feelings for her employer, it's utterly scandalous. Barrett must be told immediately. "More than told," Miss Whitmore added grimly. "She must be dismissed at once, with no references and no consideration for her future prospects. This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated." Miss Pemberton retrieved the letter and folded it carefully. "We must handle this delicately. If we simply present Barrett with accusations, he might dismiss our concerns as petty jealousy. But if he were to discover her inappropriate feelings himself—" "What do you propose?" Miss Ashworth asked. "A confrontation. We arrange for Barrett to overhear us questioning her about these feelings. Once she's forced to admit the truth, he'll have no choice but to send her away. No decent man could keep a servant who has overstepped such fundamental boundaries." Miss Whitmore nodded approvingly. "It would also demonstrate our concern for maintaining proper household standards. Exactly the kind of vigilance he should expect from his future wife." The three women spent the remainder of the afternoon planning their strategy with military precision. They would wait until evening, when Barrett typically reviewed his accounts in the study adjacent to the kitchen. Then they would corner Lina during her dinner preparations, ostensibly to discuss household arrangements, but actually to force an admission of her feelings within Barrett's hearing. What they failed to consider was how their plan might reveal as much about their own characters as about Lina's supposed transgression, their eagerness to destroy a defenseless servant, their casual assumption that Barrett would automatically take their side, and their willingness to use discovery of private emotions as a weapon, all spoke to a fundamental lack of compassion that might give pause to any thoughtful observer. As evening approached and rain continued to drum against the windows, the three women prepared for their confrontation with the confidence of those who believed righteousness was on their side. They had found the perfect weapon to eliminate their most dangerous rival. Not another lady of breeding and accomplishment, but a simple servant whose only crime was loving someone far above her station. Lina, busy in the kitchen preparing dinner, and unaware that her most private thoughts had been discovered, hummed softly as she worked. She had no idea that the letter she had written in a moment of emotional vulnerability, the letter she had hidden away and forgotten, was about to destroy not only her position, but potentially her entire future. The storm outside intensified as evening fell, but the real tempest was brewing within the walls of the Langford ranch house, where three determined women prepared to use love as a weapon and private emotions as ammunition in their war for social advancement. In his study, Barrett worked over his ledgers, unaware that his careful consideration of marriage candidates was about to be overtaken by events that would force him to confront not only what he wanted in a wife, but what kind of man he truly was. The confrontation unfolded exactly as the three women had planned. With one crucial exception, they had underestimated both Barrett's capacity for observation and his growing awareness of their true natures. Barrett sat at his desk reviewing cattle breeding records when he heard the sound of multiple footsteps approaching the kitchen. The voices that followed were pitched just loud enough to carry clearly through the thin wall between his study and the cooking area, a volume that suggested calculation rather than natural conversation. "Lina," Miss Pemberton's voice rang out with artificial sweetness, "we need to discuss some household arrangements for the future." "Of course, Miss Pemberton," came Lina's polite reply. "How may I help you?" Barrett set down his pen, something in the tone of the exchange alerting him to pay attention. Through the partially open door of his study, he could see into the kitchen, where the four women had arranged themselves in what looked distinctly like a tribunal. Miss Ashworth stepped forward, producing the folded letter with theatrical flourish. "We found this hidden in your quarters and, frankly, were shocked by its contents." Barrett watched Lina's face drain of color as she recognized the paper. Her eyes darted between the three accusers, and he could see the exact moment she realized the trap that had been laid for her. "That was private," Lina said quietly, her voice barely audible from where Barrett sat. "You had no right—" "No right?" Miss Whitmore interrupted sharply, pulling a riding crop from behind her back, a symbol of the class distinctions she was determined to enforce. "We have every right to be concerned about inappropriate behavior in this household. Do you realize what you've written here?" Miss Pemberton unfolded the letter and began reading selected passages aloud, her voice carrying clearly to Barrett's hiding place. "I have watched you these past months. I wish I could tell you that what you seek is not found in musical accomplishments. If I could have one wish, it would be that you might find someone who sees you as I do." Each quoted phrase fell like a physical blow. Barrett felt his chest tighten as he heard his own private moments with Lina exposed and twisted into evidence of impropriety. The garden conversation, their shared appreciation for simple beauty, the midnight encounter in the kitchen, all of it reduced to fodder for public humiliation. "How dare you harbor such inappropriate feelings for your employer?" Miss Ashworth demanded, brandishing the riding crop like a weapon. "Don't you understand your place in this household?" Lina stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tremor Barrett could hear underneath. "I understand my place perfectly, Miss Ashworth. I also understand that feelings cannot always be controlled, only actions. I have never acted inappropriately toward Mr. Langford, nor would I ever presume to do so. Writing love letters isn't acting inappropriately," Miss Whitmore snapped. "I wrote no love letter," Lina replied with quiet dignity. "I wrote private thoughts that were never intended for anyone's eyes. thoughts that I kept to myself precisely because I understood they were inappropriate to express. Barrett found himself leaning forward, struck by the crucial distinction Lina had drawn. She had not pursued him or attempted to use her position for personal gain. Instead, she had recognized the impossibility of her feelings and kept them private, harming no one. Miss Pemberton moved closer to Lina, her voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow made her words more cruel. "You must see how impossible your situation has become. Mr. Langford cannot keep a servant who harbors romantic delusions about her employer. It would be scandalous." "What I think," Miss Ashworth added with cold satisfaction, "is that you should pack your belongings tonight and leave first thing in the morning. Without references, of course. No respectable household would want a servant who doesn't understand proper boundaries." Barrett watched Lina absorb this pronouncement with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the ordeal. She didn't protest. The unfairness of being punished for private thoughts didn't point out that they had violated her privacy by searching her quarters and reading her personal writings. Instead, she simply nodded. "If that is what you believe best," she said softly. "I will, of course, complete tonight's dinner service before I go." The dignity of her response seemed to frustrate her accusers, who had clearly expected tears, protests, or some other reaction they could use to further justify their cruelty. "See that you do," Miss Whitmore said, raising the riding crop slightly, "and don't think to appeal to Mr. Langford's sympathy. Any decent man would be horrified to learn of your presumption." It was this final cruelty, the assumption that Barrett would automatically side with them, the casual wielding of the riding crop as a symbol of power over someone they considered beneath them, that finally moved Barrett to action. He rose from his desk with deliberate slowness, his decision crystallizing with each step toward the kitchen. When he appeared in the doorway, all four women turned toward him with expressions ranging from triumph to terror. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying a coldness they had never heard before, "I believe we need to discuss what constitutes appropriate behavior in my household." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Pemberton still held the letter in her hands, Miss Ashworth gripped the riding crop with white knuckles, and Miss Whitmore's mouth opened and closed without sound. Only Lina remained composed, though Barrett could see the resignation in her eyes as she prepared for her final dismissal. But Barrett's next words surprised everyone, including himself. "Miss Pemberton, Miss Ashworth, Miss Whitmore, I believe your carriages can be prepared within the hour. Your courtship of me is concluded." The shocked gasps from his three former suitors filled the kitchen, but Barrett's attention was focused entirely on Lina, whose eyes had widened with something that might have been hope. "As for you, Miss Reyes," he continued, his voice gentling, "I believe we have matters to discuss, but not tonight, and certainly not in front of an audience that has already shown such poor judgment." The riding crop fell from Miss Ashworth's nerveless fingers, clattering against the kitchen floor, a symbol of artificial authority finally fallen to earth. Lina's response did not come immediately. She stood in her small room, Barrett's proposal hanging in the air between them like something too precious and fragile to touch. Her hands remained in his, but her eyes searched his face as if trying to determine whether this moment was real or simply another dream that would dissolve with morning light. "You're asking me to marry you," she said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they would hold their meaning. "I am," Barrett confirmed, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Though I realize I'm doing it in perhaps the most unromantic circumstances possible, in a maid's quarters after a thoroughly disastrous evening." A small smile touched the corners of Lina's mouth. "I don't think I could have imagined it any other way. Grand gestures and formal parlor proposals seem to belong to a different world entirely." "The world I thought I wanted," Barrett agreed, "but not the world I actually need." Lina gently extracted her hands from his and moved to her small window, looking out at the garden that had become her sanctuary. Barrett waited, understanding that she needed time to process not just his proposal, but the complete upheaval of everything she had believed about her place in the world. "Do you understand what you're asking?" she said finally, her voice thoughtful rather than emotional. "It's not just about us, Barrett. Your family has expectations, traditions going back generations. The community sees you in a certain way. Marriage to your maid would be scandalous," Barrett supplied. "Certainly, socially ruinous, possibly. The best decision I've ever made? I believe so." From his pocket, Barrett withdrew the silver locket that had belonged to Eleanor, the family heirloom he had been considering as an engagement gift for one of his society candidates. But now, as he looked at it in the lamplight of Lina's simple, a room, it seemed to represent something entirely different. "This was Eleanor's," he said, opening the locket to reveal the tiny portrait inside. "I had planned to give it to my new bride as a symbol of continuing the Langford family traditions." Lina turned from the window, her eyes focusing on the delicate piece of jewelry with its precious cargo of memory. "But I realize now that the most important Langford tradition isn't about maintaining social position," Barrett continued. "It's about choosing love over convenience, authenticity over appearance. My great-grandfather chose my great-grandmother, not because she came from a prominent family, she didn't, but because she was willing to build something meaningful with him in the middle of nowhere. They created this ranch together through shared work and mutual respect." He closed the locket and set it on Lina's small table beside her work gloves, two artifacts representing vastly different approaches to life and love. "I won't lie to you about what this choice would mean," Barrett said. "There will be social consequences. Some doors that were open to us individually will close to us as a couple. There will be whispers, judgment, people who will never accept our marriage as legitimate, and that doesn't concern you. It concerns me far less than the thought of spending my life with someone who sees other people as obstacles to her own advancement. What I witnessed tonight, the casual cruelty, the willingness to destroy someone defenseless for the sake of personal gain, showed me something about the society I was so eager to impress." Lina moved back to her bed and sat down, her expression thoughtful. "My mother used to say that you can judge a person's true character by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Tonight showed you who those women really were, and it showed me who you really are," Barrett said. "Even when they attacked you unfairly, even when they threatened your livelihood and your future, you maintained your dignity. You didn't fight back or try to drag them down to your level. What good would that have done? None at all, but most people would have tried anyway. That's what makes you extraordinary, Lina. Not your social graces or your family connections, but your fundamental decency." Lina picked up the locket from the table, studying Eleanor's gentle face in the portrait. She was beautiful, and clearly a lady of refinement. She was. "But do you know what I remember most about Eleanor? Not her musical accomplishments or her elegant entertaining. I remember how she always saved scraps from dinner for the barn cats, even though the other ladies thought it was beneath her dignity. I remember how she learned the names of every ranch hand's children and asked about them when she met their parents in town. She sounds like a woman worth honoring. She was, and I think she would have recognized a kindred spirit in you. You both understood that true refinement comes from kindness, not from expensive education." Lina closed the locket and held it carefully in her palm. "If I were to say yes, and I'm not saying I am, what would happen to the other traditions? The expectations about the kind of wife the master of Langford Ranch should have?" Barrett moved to sit beside her on the narrow bed, the small space forcing an intimacy that felt both natural and revolutionary. "We would create new traditions, better ones, based on partnership rather than performance, on genuine affection rather than social advantage. You make it sound simple. The decision is simple. Living with the consequences might be more complicated. But Lina," Barrett turned to face her fully, "these past months have taught me that a life lived to meet other people's expectations is no life at all. I want to wake up each morning next to someone who makes me want to be a better man, not someone who makes me look like a more successful one." Lina was quiet for a long moment, holding the locket and considering everything he had said. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm with decision. "I have one condition." Barrett's heart leaped with hope at the implicit acceptance in her words. "Name it. I want to keep working, not as your maid, that would be impossible now. But I want to be your true partner in running this ranch. I want to tend the gardens, work with the horses, help make decisions about the household and the land. I don't want to become a lady of leisure who has lost touch with the work that gives life meaning." Barrett felt a smile spread across his face. "I wouldn't want you any other way." Lina opened the locket one more time, looking at Eleanor's portrait, as if seeking blessing from the woman who had come before her. Then she snapped it closed and looked directly into Barrett's eyes. "Then yes, Barrett Langford, I will marry you, not because you can give me a better life, but because together we might build a life worth living." The engagement ring he placed on her finger was not the elaborate diamond he had planned to offer one of his society candidates, but a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. Practical, beautiful, and strong enough to last a lifetime of real work and genuine partnership. News of Barrett Langford's engagement to his maid spread through Texas society with the speed and destructive force of a prairie fire. By the end of the week, the story had appeared in newspapers from Austin to Fort Worth, each account more sensationalized than the last. The headline in the San Antonio Express captured the general tone. "Prominent rancher shocks society. Wealthy cattle baron to wed Mexican servant girl." Barrett first encountered the public reaction when he rode into town for supplies. The following Saturday, the usual friendly greetings from merchants and fellow ranchers were replaced by awkward silences, pointed stares, and whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when he approached. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, who had always been effusively welcoming, served him with brittle politeness and avoided meeting his eyes. The most painful encounter came at the bank, where Barrett had conducted business for over a decade. Mr. Carlyle, the bank president, invited him into his private office with an expression of grave concern. "Barrett, my boy," the older man began, settling heavily behind his mahogany desk, "I feel obligated to speak plainly about this unfortunate situation." "What situation would that be, Harold?" Barrett asked, though he knew perfectly well what was coming. "This engagement. Surely you can see how it appears to the community. A man of your standing, your family's reputation." Carlyle shook his head sadly. "There must be some explanation. Perhaps the girl has entrapped you somehow, made false claims about your relationship." Barrett felt his jaw tighten. "Lina has done nothing but accept my proposal of marriage. A proposal I made freely and with full consideration of the consequences. But Barrett, think of what you're throwing away. Your social position, your family's legacy, your standing in the community. And for what? A servant girl who has more genuine character than most of the so-called ladies of society combined," Barrett interrupted firmly. "I appreciate your concern, Harold, but my decision is final." The conversation continued in this vein for several uncomfortable minutes, with Carlyle alternating between expressions of shock and attempts to reason with what he clearly considered temporary insanity. Similar scenes played out across town as Barrett completed his errands, each interaction reinforcing how thoroughly his choice had violated social expectations. But the newspaper coverage proved even more challenging than the personal encounters. The Society page reporter had somehow obtained detailed accounts of the failed courtship, painting Barrett as a wealthy eccentric who had been seduced by an opportunistic servant. Lina was described in terms that made Barrett's blood boil, the calculating Mexican girl who set her sights above her station, and a domestic who exploited her employer's loneliness for personal gain. When Barrett returned home with the newspapers, he found Lina in the garden, tending to her plants with hands that trembled slightly despite her outward composure. The papers lay open beside her on the wooden crate she used as a seat, and it was clear she had read every painful word. "I'm sorry," Barrett said, settling beside her and gathering the offensive publications. "These people don't know you, don't know us. Their opinions shouldn't matter." "But they do matter," Lina said quietly, her voice steady but sad. "Not to me personally, but they matter to you. This is the community you live in, do business with, depend on for connections and support. I never intended to cost you so much." Barrett took her dirt-stained hands in his, noting how the engagement ring caught the afternoon light. "You haven't cost me anything worth keeping. What I've lost is the good opinion of people who judge others based on circumstances of birth rather than content of character. Your bank president, your business associates, the families you've known for years. They all think you've made a terrible mistake. Then they don't know me as well as they thought they did." Barrett lifted her chin so she would meet his eyes. "Lina, I won't pretend this isn't difficult. I won't lie and say their rejection doesn't sting. But I would rather have their disapproval and your love than their approval and a lifetime of regret." That evening brought the first direct challenge to their engagement when Barrett's sister Martha arrived unannounced from Dallas, her face grim with determination and her traveling dress speaking of urgent purpose. "Barrett, what in God's name are you thinking?" she demanded without preamble, sweeping into the parlor like an avenging angel. "The whole state is talking about this scandal. Father's friends are calling me, asking if you've lost your mind entirely." "It's good to see you too, Martha," Barrett said dryly. "I take it you've heard about my engagement." "Engagement?" Martha's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter crystal. "You call this madness an engagement? Barrett, she's a servant. A Mexican servant with no family, no breeding, no accomplishments worthy of the name." "She's the woman I love," Barrett replied simply. "The woman who makes me happier than I've been since Eleanor died. The woman who sees me as more than a bank account and social position." Martha paced the parlor like a caged animal, her hands gesturing wildly as she catalogued the social disasters this marriage would bring. "Think of our family name. Think of the Langford legacy. Think of the children you might have and how they'll be treated in society." "I am thinking of them," Barrett said. "I'm thinking they'll be raised by a mother who values kindness over status, who will teach them to judge people by their actions rather than their ancestry." "This is impossible," Martha declared, sinking into Eleanor's favorite chair as if the weight of family shame had physically overwhelmed her. "The family will never accept this. Society will never accept this. You'll be cut off from everything that matters. If everything that matters can be lost by choosing love over convenience," Barrett said quietly, "then perhaps it never mattered as much as I thought." The argument continued late into the night, with Martha employing every weapon in her considerable arsenal: family duty, social responsibility, financial consequences, and finally, tears of genuine distress for her brother's future. But Barrett remained unmoved, his certainty only growing stronger in the face of such determined opposition. When Martha finally departed the next morning, her parting words were a mixture of warning and reluctant affection. "I pray you don't live to regret this, Barrett. But if you do, remember that family love survives even the worst mistakes." As her carriage disappeared down the drive, Barrett stood on his porch with the latest newspaper in his hands, this one featuring an editorial questioning whether men of wealth could be trusted to make rational decisions about marriage, using his engagement as evidence of the corrupting influence of too much money and too little social oversight. He folded the paper carefully and walked to the kitchen, where Lina was preparing breakfast with her usual competence despite the upheaval. "Surrounding their lives, any regrets?" she asked softly, not looking up from her work. Barrett set the newspaper aside and drew her into his arms, feeling the rightness of her presence against all the noise of social disapproval. "Only one," he said against her hair. "That I wasted. So much time caring what anyone else thought about who I should love. Outside, the world might condemn their choice, but inside the walls of the Langford ranch house, two people had found something worth fighting for, and they intended to prove that love truly could beat gold, no matter what society said about. In 3 weeks after the scandal broke across Texas society, Barrett and Lina were married on a crisp autumn morning that painted the hill country in shades of gold and crimson. The ceremony bore no resemblance to the grand social event Barrett might have hosted for one of his society candidates. No elaborate flower arrangements, no string quartet, no reception for 200 guests in the main house parlor. Instead, they exchanged vows in Lina's garden, surrounded by the plants she had nurtured through careful seasons of growth. The setting was simple but profound, with morning glories climbing the makeshift altar and the scent of late-blooming roses carried on the gentle breeze. Father Miguel from the small Mexican church in town had agreed to perform the ceremony, his weathered face kind as he spoke about love, transcending all earthly boundaries. The guest list was small but meaningful. Tom Rodriguez, Barrett's longtime foreman, stood as best man, his usually stern face softened by genuine happiness for his employer. Maria Santos, who ran the boarding house in town and had known Lina since childhood, served as matron of honor, her eyes bright with tears of joy for the girl she had watched grow into such a remarkable woman. A handful of ranch hands attended, men who had worked the Langford land for years and had seen firsthand the kindness both Barrett and Lina showed to those in their employ. Their presence spoke volumes about loyalty earned through character rather than demanded through position. Notably absent were Barrett's sister, Martha, who had returned to Dallas in tears of frustration, and virtually every member of the social circle that had once formed the foundation of his public life. The empty spaces where these relationships had been felt poignant but not devastating. Barrett had discovered that some losses revealed themselves to be gains in disguise. Lina wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slender frame. The white cotton was simple but beautiful, adorned with delicate embroidery that spoke of patient hours and loving hands. She had woven wildflowers from the creek beds into her dark hair, the same Mexican buckeye and blue bonnets she had described to Barrett during their garden conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. Barrett chose to forego the formal mourning coat that tradition would have demanded, instead wearing his best everyday suit with a white shirt and simple tie. Around his neck hung a small wooden cross that Lina had carved for him during their engagement, her first attempt at woodworking, imperfect but precious beyond measure. The ceremony itself was conducted in both English and Spanish, honoring both their backgrounds while acknowledging the new life they were creating together. When Father Miguel asked Barrett to state his intentions, his words were simple but profound. "I take you, Lina, not because you can enhance my position or advance my interests, but because you have shown me what it means to live with grace, kindness, and authenticity. I promise to be your partner in all things, to value your wisdom, and to never forget that the greatest wealth lies in being loved by someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway." Lina's vows were equally heartfelt. "I take you, Barrett, not for what you can give me, but for who you are when all the world's expectations fall away. I promise to be your companion in both abundance and hardship, to help you tend not just this land, but the dreams we plant together, and to love you not as my employer or my better, but as my equal and my heart's choice." The exchange of rings carried special significance. Barrett had commissioned a local silversmith to create matching bands from silver mined in Texas, simple, strong, and beautiful without ostentation. As they slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the simple gold band that had served as Lina's engagement ring was joined by its companion, both catching the morning light like promises made visible. The moment that sealed their union was witnessed by the vastness of the Texas sky and the quiet approval of those who had chosen to support love over convention. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Barrett's kiss was gentle but certain, while Lina's response carried all the joy of dreams finally given permission to take root in reality. The reception was held in the ranch house kitchen, the heart of the home where their relationship had truly begun. Maria Santos had prepared Lina's favorite foods: tamales, fresh tortillas, and a wedding cake decorated with the same wildflowers that adorned the bride's hair. Tom Rodriguez offered a toast that was both simple and perfect. To Barrett and Lina, may your marriage be like good land, growing more beautiful and more valuable with each passing season. As the afternoon wore on, and their few guests departed with warm wishes and promises to visit soon, Barrett and Lina found themselves alone in the kitchen where they had shared midnight coffee and honest conversation. The setting felt exactly right, not a grand ballroom or formal parlor, but the place where real life happened, where two people had learned to see each other clearly. "Any regrets?" Barrett asked, echoing Lina's question from weeks earlier. "Only that we waited so long to be honest about our feelings," Lina replied, adjusting the simple gold band on her finger. "Though perhaps we needed time to grow into people worthy of this kind of love." Barrett pulled her close, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair and feeling the absolute rightness of this woman in his arms. Outside, the sun was setting over land that now belonged to both of them equally, painting the sky in colors that matched the autumn leaves. They had chosen each other over the expectations of society, over the security of convention, over everything that might have seemed practical or wise. In return, they had gained something that no amount of social approval could provide: a partnership built on genuine understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of love that made every day feel like a new beginning. The simple gold band on Lina's finger caught the last light of their wedding day, a circle of promise that spoke not of wealth or status, but of two hearts that had finally found their way home to each other. 1 year later, Barrett stood on the same porch where this story had begun, coffee mug in hand, surveying his land as the morning sun painted the Texas hill country in familiar shades of gold and amber. But everything else had changed in ways that made the similarities feel like echoes from another man's life. The most obvious transformation was visible just beyond the kitchen door, where Lina's small herb garden had expanded into a magnificent tapestry of vegetables, flowers, and fruit trees that drew visitors from neighboring counties. True to her unconventional philosophy, she had mixed everything together in glorious abundance: tomatoes climbing among morning glories, marigolds scattered between rows of beans, apple trees providing shade for delicate herbs that couldn't tolerate the full Texas sun. The garden had become famous throughout the region, not for its orderly perfection, but for its incredible productivity and natural beauty. Agricultural specialists came to study how mixing flowers with vegetables could increase yields and reduce pest problems. Society ladies who had once snubbed Lina now arrived uninvited, hoping to learn her secrets for creating beauty from practical necessity. But Barrett knew the garden's true success lay not in any revolutionary technique, but in the love and attention Lina brought to every seed, every plant, every season of growth. She worked in the garden each morning as the sun rose, often humming the same Mexican lullabies her mother had taught her, and Barrett had taken to joining her whenever ranch business allowed. This morning, he found her kneeling beside a new section. She was preparing for spring planting, her hands gentle as she worked packet after packet of seeds into the rich earth. The seeds themselves had become a symbol of their transformed life. Not expensive, imported varieties chosen for their prestige, but simple, reliable flowers and vegetables, selected for their ability to thrive in Texas soil and bring joy to ordinary days. "Planning another expansion?" Barrett asked, settling beside her on the wooden bench he had built for their first anniversary. "Always," Lina smiled, brushing dirt from her hands before leaning against his shoulder. "I was thinking we might add a section for herbs that Maria uses in her cooking. She's been asking about cilantro and epazote that would grow well in this climate." Barrett nodded, unsurprised that his wife's gardening plans included helping others. Over the past year, Lina had quietly become the unofficial agricultural advisor for dozens of small farmers and gardeners throughout the area, sharing seeds, techniques, and encouragement with anyone who asked. The transformation extended far beyond the garden. The ranch house itself had evolved under Lina's influence, becoming warmer and more welcoming without losing any of its dignity. Eleanor's formal parlor still existed, but it was now balanced by a comfortable family room where Barrett could carve. By the fireplace, while Lina mended clothes or planned the next season's planting, the kitchen had become the true heart of the home, just as Barrett had imagined during their midnight conversation over coffee and bread. Lina's cooking drew ranch hands, neighbors, and even former critics who discovered that good food and genuine hospitality could bridge social gaps that had seemed insurmountable. The social consequences of their marriage had proven less devastating than predicted. While some doors had indeed closed, others had opened in unexpected ways. Barrett found himself part of a community he had never noticed before. Hard-working families, honest merchants, people who valued character over pedigree, and judged success by different standards than bank account balances. The ranch's business had actually prospered under their partnership. Lina's practical mind and attention to detail complemented Barrett's broader vision, and their shared commitment to treating employees fairly had resulted in loyalty and productivity that impressed even former critics. Most surprisingly, their marriage had begun to influence other relationships throughout the community. Tom Rodriguez had finally proposed to the school teacher he had been courting for years, inspired by seeing his employer choose love over convention. Several young men from prominent families had begun paying attention to women they might previously have overlooked, and at least 3 marriages had taken place between partners of different social classes. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had chosen differently?" Barrett asked, watching a bee work its way methodically through the herb blossoms. "You mean if you had married Miss Pemberton or Miss Ashworth?" Lina considered the question. "Seriously, I think you would have been exactly what you expected to be, a successful rancher with a proper wife and an appropriate place in society. But I don't think you would have been happy. And what about you? Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you had stayed just the maid?" Lina was quiet for a moment, her eyes traveling across the garden that had grown from her. Simple dream of a small patch of earth to call her own. "I would have been safe, secure in my position, clear about my place in the world, but I never would have discovered what I was truly capable of." Barrett understood exactly what she meant. Marriage to Lina had revealed aspects of himself he hadn't known existed, a capacity for partnership that went beyond mere companionship, a joy in simple pleasures that wealth alone could never provide, a kind of contentment that came from being truly known and accepted by another person. The sound of horses approaching interrupted their morning reflection. Barrett looked up to see a familiar carriage coming through the ranch gates. His sister Martha, making her first visit since their wedding day. "Are you ready for this?" Lina asked quietly, sensing his tension. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything." Martha emerged from the carriage looking older than her years, her face carefully composed, but her eyes revealing a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. She had come, Barrett suspected, because her friends in Dallas society had grown tired of her dramatic pronouncements about her brother's ruined life. The reality was that Barrett appeared happier and more prosperous than ever, which complicated the narrative of disaster she had been constructing. "Martha," Barrett said, rising, to embrace his sister with genuine warmth. "Welcome home." "Thank you for having me," Martha replied, her gaze taking in the expanded garden, the comfortable additions to the house, the obvious prosperity that surrounded them. I wanted to meet your wife properly, to see how you've been." Lina stepped forward with the same quiet dignity she had shown on their first meeting, extending her hand with a smile that held no trace of defensiveness or triumph. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you, Martha. Barrett speaks of you often and with great affection." What followed was perhaps the most important conversation of Barrett's married life, as three people worked to build bridges across differences that had once seemed unbridgeable. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but by the time Martha departed 3 days later, she had gained a sister-in-law she respected, and Barrett had reclaimed a family relationship he had feared was lost forever. As evening approached, and Barrett and Lina walked through the garden together, examining the new growth that promised abundant harvests in seasons to come,